Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today is episode 28 of my secular Bible study series in which we are looking at Hosea. Hosea is the first of our 12 minor prophets, and then we'll be moving on to the New Testament. I know many people skip these books of the Bible with maybe the exception of Jonah, and only because that story is so much fun. But I'd encourage you to still watch these episodes. I know we're looking forward to the New Testament. Trust me, I'm really excited to get to it, but there's still a lot of importance in understanding this last part of the Old Testament. So, Hosea again is only 14 chapters, and I think with smaller books like this, the easiest thing to do for point one book overview is just to go through the chapters and talk about what's happening here in the book. And the first 3 chapters of Hosea are setting the stage for this living metaphor that we get from Hosea that has been unfairly put on him by God himself. Hosea is told by God who to marry with the foreknowledge that this woman is a cheater, a harlot. But God really needs to drive home this comparison between Israel being like a wayward wife, and thus his just punishment as the man who owns these people, this woman. So to embody this into reality, he has Hosea marries this woman and even has him name his children in a fashion that will represent what is to come, God's punishment, wrath, etc. Now, you could almost make a positive case for God in some parts, definitely not all parts of this book, as we'll see when we get to problematic passages in part 7. God instructs Hosea to love his wife Gomer regardless of the infidelity, to pay off her debts to all the men she's had children with, to accept her still as his own. And in this way, we are supposed to see God loving us even though Israel broke their covenant with God, which by the way was never open for discussion. But they break the covenant, so in the same way as a wife breaking her covenant to her husband, God is going to eventually, not right away, show love and mercy to his people, but not before first having them completely taken over. Many of them die horrendous deaths, etc. The thing that's so interesting to understand here is this collective punishment, this collective identity. God is playing the long-term game of his people and him. The individuals in between all of this don't really matter, which I think is where the analogy becomes so false between a husband and his wife. But I digress. I don't want to get too hung up here. So that's really the first 3 chapters. Chapter 4 is when the Lord accuses Israel by way of Hosea. After all these prophets are here to do is to warn and to accuse. This is a very familiar pattern. So we have to lay the case for why Israel, and by the way, this is the northern kingdom of Israel. This is a good bit after the civil war, and we have the separated kingdoms into north and south. Hosea is in the north and goes through a series of evil kings. I'm pretty sure all the kings of the north were considered bad, and only a few of the south were considered good, unless I have that flip-flopped. So Hosea has these horrible kings and these horrible priests also. That's part of what's laid out here in chapter 4 that are leading the people astray. We have idol worship, we have prostitution, we have people that don't know God. They don't understand God at all anymore. But again, the main comparison is to a prostitute because God just can't get away from his love of calling his people sinful whores. Chapter 5 is just more along this same line of thinking, a little heavier on the priest role here and how much they have led the people astray. God is clear to say, don't worry, you'll seek me when you're distressed, and that distress is coming. This is part of the prophecy of the warning of what will come, which is a really funny thing because all that Hosea is alluding to is that the current pact with the Assyrians is going to go sour and Assyria is going to take them over, which is indeed what happens. But that's kind of like all the Christians yelling right now at the US, if you guys continue to go down this sinful path, these other superpowers nearby are going to come get us, China, Russia, whatever. How the Christians have turned it into such prophecy that is so specific, supposedly, and so amazing that only a God-given prophetic ability could have foreseen. It's like, no, this was the superpower around them. They had alliances kind of at this point with Assyria and with Egypt, and Assyria was starting to sour. Like, that's it. But we get, of course, at the end of each of these chapters, kind of this, but don't worry, we can still get out of this, but you've got to turn from your ways. So then we'll move into chapter 6, which is Israel and Judah are unrepentant. And this chapter really focuses on their insincerity. Yes, they're repenting. Yes, they're still making sacrifices. Yes, they're still going to the temple. But how much could they mean it? It's kind of like they're obviously just taking advantage of the system and the get out of jail free card, because we also see them worshiping other gods. We also see them continue in their sin. The tale is as old as time. But once again, God says, hey, I can still help. I still want to help, But come on, guys. And here we get comparisons to other people that have come before them. I'm pretty sure it's in this chapter that we get the allusion to Adam and how we have this unfaithfulness, this pattern that needs to be addressed before God. Chapter 7 is just more threats and warnings. We get the continuation of accusations against these people and the need for a formal rebuke and a repentance of these people. Chapter 8 has one of the funnest kind of titles. You know, the beginning of each chapter has a small title, and these are different from book to book and canon to canon, but it's just a summary of the chapter, and it's Israel will reap the whirlwind, which I just think is the funniest sentence, but I digress. Here's what chapter 8 is about. We see that God is still not over the calf idol incident at Bethel, and things are starting to really heat up for the Assyrian attack that will be God's justice against them. Chapter 9 is just more threats of God punishing Israel, but with a little bit of a different tone. First, we have this hot anger, this burning attitude against Israel's sin and idolatry. The exile is now emphasized and impending. The prophet declares, "You will eat unclean food in Assyria." Like, hey, we're almost too late now. And we see this softening of God where he kind of remembers Israel in the days of their youth and what they've been through. And I haven't done a very good job of showing just how bipolar this God is coming across in this book. We see him so angry. We see him comforting himself with his own grace and mercy, being moved by his own love for these people. Like, how can I forget you? And once again, we see God characterized as this angry, abusive lover that to some degree does care for his bride, but his jealousy cannot get over the wrong that she has done him. He wants her, but he hates her. He has to punish her because she has to learn, but he wished he didn't have to do so. If only she would have loved him better. If only she would have crawled back correctly and with more sincerity. 10, we get kind of that softer bend, sowing righteousness and thus reaping mercy. It's kind of a conflated chapter with this back and forth, and really just a recap of 4 through 9. And then we get something different with 11, and then we move on to 12 to 14, which is kind of its own little section. So getting to 11, we have the Lord's love for Israel. And this is, again, could be, if it wasn't contained with so much baggage, beautiful. We get this scene of God teaching Israel to walk, having them as this young child. A very mixed metaphor considering that we have just called them prostitutes and whores, but we see Israel growing up, gaining their independence, not needing God anymore, rebelling against God, and the consequences for that rebellion. But again, here we see especially, even though I just mentioned it in the previous one, God struggling against his own desire to do that. And again, where we get that verse that I just mentioned, "How can I give you up, O Ephraim," which is what they were calling northern Israel, at least in this book. "How can I hand you over, O Israel? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender." So again, he is just struggling with what he seems to be feeling is his duty to chastise this wayward child. Again, it could be lovely if we don't see that the chastisement does indeed happen, that it's horrific, and that it's in addition to everything else that we have covered in these last 27 episodes. So now we get to chapters 12 through 14, which is its ending sections. 12 and 13 are these callbacks to other times in Israel's past where they have messed up and God has had to punish them, but he's also been faithful to come back around. So it's kind of just showing us that this pattern exists and that really we need to break it at some point, but it's not going to be now. So he specifically talks about Jacob's deceitfulness. We talk about the rebellion that happened, I believe, in the book of Numbers when they were in the wilderness, and a few other examples. And 13 has specifically one of the most horrendous verses in the book. We'll talk about it in point 7 with problematic passages. And then it ends with chapter 14, which, like so many of these books, they kind of take the last chapter to show this glimmer of hope or of this call for repentance. And 14 is labeled as a plea to return to the Lord, a final call of repentance. We get the assurance of restoration if they'll do the right thing. And here we see a writer that is not Hosea kind of giving us this overview of the book and this call to wisdom, which leads us nicely into point 2, which is authorship and date. So let's get into that. Traditional authorship says that Hosea wrote these. And again, much of this, by the way, is in poem fashion, which we'll talk about in point 4. And we have every reason to believe that Hosea did indeed write this. That's not so much the question around authorship. The big question is, was there anything added in after the fact? Were there edits, redactions? Who is this other writer that clearly was the one that compiled Hosea's poems and then gives us this afterthought at the end of the book? Also, when exactly was it compiled and written? Because it seems like some of the add-ons happened at a later point. As for date, Hosea's ministry is typically seen in the 8th century BCE, again, after the split of the two kingdoms, maybe about a couple hundred years after the fact, and specifically within the Northern Kingdom and its time period. Which moves us into point 3, historical accuracy, background, and context. We don't have as much information about what happened with the Northern Kingdom, at least verified extra biblical information or archaeological information, as say we do with the Babylonian exile of the Southern Kingdom. There's also not a lot of large specific names, places, dates kind of claims within the book of Hosea. It's more about what was going on in the context of the spiritual battle within the religious group itself, and what were they worried about politically that they then mapped on to their rebellion against God as punishment, and it is the Assyrians. We see it mentioned in this book about their taking it upon themselves to make these deals with Assyria and with Egypt instead of relying on God. And so what better way for God to quash that and say, you only can rely on me, you cannot be like these other nations who protect yourselves, than having the Assyrian nation say, hey, yeah, we'll turn on you. And so that's really about as far as the context of what is actually happening in the world gets brought into this specific prophetic book. So let's move on to point 4, which is literary analysis. And I think the best sentence to describe this would be a prophetic fusion of narrative and poetry. And we've seen it before. This book doesn't adhere really specifically to either of those. It just blends and mixes and ebbs and flows between this narrative, this here's what is happening, this is the succession of linear events, and also this poetry, whether it's poetry out of God's mouth itself or out of Hosea, who is warning the people, or his desire for these people not to continue to make the same mistakes. It's almost similar to Jeremiah in that fashion, the weeping prophet, but not quite so much with all of the lamenting, because we're still in the warning phase at this point. We have tons of metaphors and allegories and visions and symbols. There is a lot going on here. I think most notably of interest is this living metaphor. Now, there's of course debate. Did Hosea actually marry Gomer and have this happen, or was this a plot device used to just better represent God's feeling about his people and his place as the wronged lover who still redeems this people group despite the infidelity? It doesn't really matter how literal or not that it is, although in the book itself, it's meant to be very literal, that Hosea had a wife named Gomer who did these things, and Hosea did these things to show the people what God was willing to do for them. But still, that's taking metaphor and symbolism to a whole nother level, which isn't outside of the scope of what we've seen of many of the prophets acting these things out. I think of Ezekiel and supposedly what he did lying on his side for over a year, eating bread that was cooked over cow dung, etc. Like, they were taking it to some pretty extreme measures to really represent in a physical fashion just how real this really was. So let's move on to point 5, main themes. What are we supposed to pull out of this? Well, the first thing I think is a better understanding of this covenant. I won't further expand on that too much because I just covered it so much in the marriage analogy. But again, we have the first 25% of this book just reminding us of the covenant nature of what Israel is supposed to have with God, which leads to the second main theme, which is the consequence for unfaithfulness. Now, most of it again is that bad wife kind of example, but we do get the bad child kind of example. And I am so tired of the comparisons of God as some kind of a good father who's just been innocently wronged by his rebellious child and unfortunately has to punish them. It was the main defense in my Commanded to Love video that I did last Sunday, and I'm going to be making an entire video response about when believers tried to use this line of argumentation. But again, the second theme here would be the consequences of unfaithfulness to a mightier power. And funny enough, in stark contrast to what I just said, a third theme that is at least supposed to be conveyed through this book is God's love and steadfast faithfulness despite how horrific we, his people, are. Again, there are some really beautiful verses and ideas in this book that just end up falling so far short when you understand the entire history of this God and his people. So let's move on to point 6, reception and influence. I don't have a whole lot to say here like I typically do, except maybe its relationship to covenant theology. That's really one of the main things that comes out of Hosea, or even any of the rest of the minor prophets, is just this reminder and deeper explanation and understanding of the importance of this covenant. This is set up very well in the major prophets, and it is a thread that goes all the way through until we get to the New Testament, and that's kind of why the New Testament can, if molded correctly, fit on so well, is we're getting yet again another new covenant through Jesus, a way to be made whole, despite the fact that we could simply never live up to God's expectation of us via his original covenants. That is the only time that I've seen Hosea used is in this kind of a fashion, whether it is through a sermon or a devotional, etc. And I'm sure that that remains true for both the Jewish and Christian traditions of this book. So with that said, let's move straight into point 7. There's not a lot of internal contradictions in this book. There's some things we could definitely try to make a case for, but what I'd rather do is just read through some of the more problematic passages with you, and then we will be done. Hopefully this one was a little bit shorter than usual. It'd be nice if it lined up with the length of the book, but it doesn't always work that way. So let's go to Hosea chapter 2 to start. I'm sorry, I meant Hosea 1:2, and it is this. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go, take yourself a wife of whoredom, and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord." So it would be one thing, and funny enough, despite the clear articulation of the verse here, I've seen Christians try to say, oh, Hosea didn't know ahead of time. Yes, he did. He was supposed to go pick out Gomer, a woman that was known with this kind of a reputation. For a God that supposedly takes so seriously marriage and its important contracts here and chastity and purity, etc., to see him purposely make a man, force a man to marry a woman who he knew would be unfaithful is highly problematic for many reasons that you guys don't need me to explain to you. If we just skip ahead to verse 4, we get some divine justice issues. And the Lord said to him, "Call his name Jezreel, for in just a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. And on that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel." So again, we know that God made Hosea name his children in a symbolic way so we could understand his wrath, but also just seeing that God is purposely planning when he is going to destroy certain people, certain cities for his divine judgment and wrath is not just letting things happen on their own accord. This is not natural consequence, which is what the Christian so often likes to try to allude to for these problems. This is God making a decision, having a timeline of when and how he will destroy. But I know that's not a big problem for many people. So let's jump forward to Hosea 2:23. This is from God, and I think it's pretty telling to some of the things that I've brought up as major issues in the past. "And I will sow her for myself in the land, and I will have mercy on no mercy, and I will say to not my people, you are my people." Now, in other translations, and I think it's interesting that ESV has taken this out, it says, "I will show love to the ones that I called not my loved ones." Either way, whether we use this verbiage or the verbiage of love, we have a God that is showing once again the stark difference between a chosen people, even within a chosen people group, and the out group. That only on his own decision and for his own purposes, usually that of jealousy, like we see with Paul in the New Testament when we allow Gentiles to finally be grafted in, he will finally, only because it suits him now, show love to people that he otherwise wouldn't have. Going back to Sunday's video, tell me again this God is the embodiment of love and loves everyone unconditionally from the start. Nope. Let's go to Hosea 8:7, which is kind of a really unique verse, I think. "For they sow the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind." What a cool verse, first of all. Like, forgetting the horror of this, good poetry. "The standing grain has no heads, it shall yield no flour. If it were to yield, strangers would devour it." I don't know about you, I find this difficult to just see the intensity of God's wrath. A purposeful unbalance of heaping on more than is required from a position of judgment, at least. Now, I did already read to you Hosea 11:8-9. "How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? My heart recoils within me, my compassion grows warm and tender." We have this God that seems to be having a crisis of conscience, and I think that's problematic, at least to the way that most Christians today represent God as this perfect being, who can do no wrong, who is always the same. We hear this God out loud struggling with if he should or if he shouldn't, and to what degree, and because of unemotional attachment, not pure, perfect, divine reasoning, which also then goes to say that he would judge and punish those he doesn't have this amazing love and memory of watching them grow up from their youth more harshly. This is not a fair thing. We're always told, no, God's justice is perfect and fair. It's the highest order of logic and reason, etc. Like, no, it's emotional, which is the case that I've been trying to make through so many of these other problematic passages in previous episodes. Here, the emotion looks positive, like love, and I wish I didn't have to, if you can even call that positive, but it's very positive compared to the negative emotions of the petty, jealous, wrathful, vengeful God. So if you won't accept the emotion when I point those out, then you can't accept this emotion. And even if you accept this emotion, it's again problematic to the perfect nature of a God that doesn't think and act like a human, which is what we see here really, really clearly. I'm jumping around, but let's go back to Hosea 4:6. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I reject you from being a priest to me. And since you have forgotten the law of your God, I also will forget your children. Now, there's a whole bunch going on here that I want to point out. The link between lack of knowledge and divine rejection is insane to me. This is like the initial issue with Adam and Eve in the garden. They made the mistake before they could know the difference between right and wrong. And yet they and their children were punished for this lack of understanding that was God's own doing of not giving to them. And we see that repeated here almost to a T. Also, punishing the children for the sins of the father, once again, is something that is no longer supposed to happen, but that we still see happening. And if we even take all the verses out and we just look at God collectively punishing a group of people, there of course will be innocent children that are part of that punishment that had nothing to do in terms of bringing it upon themselves. So, wowzers. You would think in this short of a book I wouldn't have so many verses, but you'd be wrong. Let's go to Hosea 5:15. I will return again to my place. Another translation calls it my lair, until they acknowledge their guilt and seek my face, and in their distress earnestly seek me. Again, par for the course for God. Just want to point out here that God acts like this evil, angry, sad, insecure villain. I'm going to go back to my house and I'm not going to let you see me and I'm not going to interact with you. And if you beg and you plead and you repent just the way I want in just the right fashion, then and only then, after I have completely punished you, would I maybe give you a chance for redemption. Like, it's so obviously human and petty and ridiculous. Again, par for the course. I think I'll only point out two more, and we'll start with the last verse of the book, which is 14:9. And again, this would be the person who collected all these poems kind of giving his final statement or thought to us. Whoever is wise, let him understand these things. Whoever is discerning, let him know them. For the ways of the Lord are right, and the upright walk in them, but transgressors stumble in them. So again, we just have this tension with there has to be a certain level of human understanding available to any given individual to be able to forthrightly understand this and thus avoid judgment and wrath. But we're not necessarily in charge of that. God created us with a certain intellect and a certain reach and availability to understand different personalities, different mental handicaps, etc., different exposure to ideas and cultures and time and knowledge, even the availability of having this in front of us, that tying, for like the third time in this book, retribution to our knowledge seems highly problematic and really inconsistent with the concept of fairness. So that's that. And then let's just go to the verse that so many people point out from Hosea, which is 13:16. Samaria shall bear her guilt because she has rebelled against her God. They shall fall by the sword. The little ones shall be dashed in pieces, and their pregnant women ripped open. Going back to verse 4, and I'm going to skip around a little bit, but I am the Lord your God. So we have God speaking from the land of Egypt. You know no God but me, and beside me there is no Savior. It is I who knew you in the wilderness, in the land of drought. So he goes on his little tirade to establish himself. In verse 7, he says, so I am to them like a lion, like a leopard I will lurk beside the way. I will fall upon them like a bear robbed of her cubs. I will tear open their breast, and there I will devour them like a lion, like a wild beast who would rip them open. In 11, he says, so still taking responsibility, I give you a king in my anger, and I took him away in my wrath. The iniquity of Ephraim is bound up, his sin is kept in store. The pangs of childbirth come forth for him, but he is an unwise son. For at the right time he does not present himself at the opening of the womb. Oh, that stupid kid. Shall I ransom them from the power of Sheol? Shall I redeem them from death? O death, where are your plagues? O Sheol, where is your sting? Compassion is hidden from my eyes. Compassion is hidden from my eyes? Come on, this is God doing these things. Though he may flourish among his brothers, the east wind, the wind of the Lord, shall come. Not some natural consequence from an invading army, from the Lord. And his fountains shall dry up, his springs shall be parched. It shall strip his treasury of every precious thing. And then we get that verse. That is not some author in the Old Testament describing what happened or will happen as some kind of a dramatic warning. This is God taking credit all the way through. What a sick little book. And again, if you see how Christians talk about this, this is the book of God's steadfast love, his desire because of one pretty sentence in chapter 11 of his compassion, his desire to not want to hurt this person, but he has to, and he's going to, and he's going to make it as traumatic as possible. That's Hosea. Thanks for watching. Hope you learned something. Keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support, my Iconoclast, GVI, Jacob, Jason, Joe, Oliver, Perry, Rokkit, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Jarrod and Kristi, my Atheist advocates, Sparky and Todd, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of the channel, or you just enjoy this kind of content, please consider joining these fine people. Thanks and have a great day.